Welcome to this week's episode of Looking Through Luke. So glad you can join with me as we dive into and explore Luke's biography of the life of Jesus. Who Jesus was, what Jesus taught, what he did, and what he promised, what he will do. This week we're looking at Luke chapter 6 as we enter into what is one of the really important sections, perhaps the most famous section in Luke of Jesus' teaching, the kind of things that Jesus taught as he exhorted people and helped people see that with his arrival, the kingdom of God was breaking in, that he was the answer and the fulfillment of their heart's longing for God to save them. What they didn't understand was that God's plan in Jesus was to save not just them, but the whole world. Last week we discovered that Jesus declares himself to be the Lord of the Sabbath, the Lord of rest, true rest, soul rest. And out of that, the religious leaders get very upset, and we read that they begin to plot what they might do with Jesus. Jesus is now a presenting problem that needs to be dealt with, even as his popularity grows amongst the people. Well, in response to that opposition, we actually read what Jesus did next. Let me read it for you from Luke chapter 6, verse 12. One of those days, Jesus went out to a mountainside to pray and spent the night praying to God. So in response to that, he goes, he leaves, and as is his practice, he goes to a quiet place and he spends the night praying to his Father, to God the Father. When morning came, he called his disciples to him and chose 12 of them, whom he also designated apostles. Simon, whom he named Peter, his brother Andrew, James, John, Philip, Bartholomew, Matthew, Thomas, James, son of Alphaeus, Simon, who was called the Zealot, Judas, son of James, and Judas Iscariot, who became a traitor. It's interesting, isn't it? Jesus has been teaching and been performing miracles and healing and declaring that the kingdom of God has come near and people have begun to follow him. He's been calling people to follow him, which was unheard of for a rabbi, a teacher, to call disciples. But Jesus has been choosing people to follow him, and crowds of people have begun to come to Jesus and declare that he is their rabbi, their master, and that they are his disciples. Well, now we see in response to his prayer through the night, Jesus is ready to act, and he actually selects 12 of those. We think of disciples as the 12. There are many disciples, but Jesus now specifically chooses 12 from within this circle of disciples, and he chooses them for leadership. He will teach them, train them, model how they are to live and what it looks like to be his disciple. They will follow him everywhere. And so then beginning in 17, we reach a famous portion of Jesus' teaching. And that goes right to the end of chapter 6. We're not going to look at all of it today. But in verses 20 to 26, Jesus begins by stating 4 blessings or beatitudes and 4 woes, 4 things to watch out for. Actually, that's a good point. A beatitude is a pretty unusual word today. Bear with me 1 second. Hey Siri, what are the beatitudes?
The Beatitudes are sayings attributed to Jesus, and in particular 8 blessings recounted by Jesus in the Sermon on the Mount in the Gospel of Matthew and 4 in the Sermon on the Plain in the Gospel of Luke, followed by 4 woes which mirror the blessings. Should I keep going?
No, but that's really helpful. I think I'll keep going. I think we want to know more. So 4 blessings in Luke, followed by 4 woes. Series on the right track. Sayings attributed to Jesus, said by Jesus. So what are the 4 blessings? Well, let me read from verse 17. Jesus went down with his disciples, those he's chosen, and stood on a level place, that's the plain that Siri's talking about, And a large crowd of his disciples was there, and a great number of people from all over Judea, Jerusalem, and from the coastal region around Tyre and Sidon, who had come to hear him and to be healed of their diseases. Those troubled by impure spirits were cured, and the people all tried to touch him because power was coming from him and healing them all. Again, Jesus is displaying his authority and power as a way of validating that what he says is true, what he says can be trusted. So what does he say? Looking at his disciples, he's speaking to those who are following him. He said, "Blessed are you who are poor, for yours is the kingdom of God." Number one. "Blessed are you who hunger now, for you will be satisfied." Number two. "Blessed are you who weep now, for you will laugh." That's the third. "And blessed are you when people hate you, when they exclude you and insult you and reject your name as evil because of the Son of Man," which is Jesus. Now, blessing means fortune, to be fortunate or to be happy, to be contented. And I wonder, as you heard those four, if you were thinking, well, how on earth does Jesus' statements about being blessed lead to contentment? How would you consider, for example, happy are you or contented are you, blessed are you when people hate you? It's not an obvious parallel, an obvious connection or correlation to make, is it? Well, let's quickly work through the four. Firstly, blessed are you who are poor, for yours is the kingdom of God. The poor are those belonging to God, those who can live above their circumstances and trust God. He's not just talking about the material poor, he's actually talking about the poor of spirit, the spiritually poor, those who recognize their need for someone to help them, for someone to save them, for someone to rescue them. It's very hard to be saved if you don't think you need saving. It's very hard to be rescued if you're absolutely insistent on the fact that you don't need to be. I remember once going down a slide at a park, a aquatic centre. There was lots of water slides, and I was at the top of one, and I was really young. I couldn't really swim, but there were some strange adults, people I'd never met before, who were just catching children as they came down and putting them over into the shallows. And at the top, one of them said, when I was there, "Would you like us to catch you?" And I said, "No," because they're a stranger danger. I don't want someone touching me. Anyway, I went down the water slide, boom, straight into the water, into the pool, and then sank to the bottom. Couldn't swim. Watched the bubbles going up. Didn't think I needed help. Of course I did, and eventually, fortunately, someone realized that and fished me out of the bottom and took me over to where it was shallow and I could stand. Blessed are those who are poor. Blessed are those who recognize their neediness, their spiritual neediness. Until you recognize it, says Jesus, you can't inherit the kingdom of God. But if you do recognize it, you're so fortunate because the kingdom of God has come in Jesus. Secondly, blessed are you who hunger now, for you will be satisfied. It's very similar in some senses to the first one. To be hungry is to recognize that something's missing. There's a sense of lack. Well, says Jesus, when you recognize that sense of lack as you hunger for something to fill you, if you look to him, if you're one of his disciples, says Jesus, you'll be satisfied. It reminds me, particularly since we were looking last episode at Jesus' declaration that he's the Lord of rest. It reminds me of St. Augustine's famous quote, "O God, our hearts are restless until they find their rest in thee." If you're hungry, says Jesus, if you sense your lack, that something's missing, you will be satisfied as you discover that satisfaction in Jesus. Number 3, blessed are you who weep now, for you will laugh. Now, I like to laugh a lot. In fact, you can't see or hear this, but Matthew, who puts all these together, his dad has one of the most recognizable laughs of anyone I've ever met. And I hear that, and whenever you hear it, and usually it rings out on its own, maybe it's because he's so smart and intelligent, he gets jokes just that much quicker than anybody else. Or maybe it's because it's really not that funny, but he finds it funny, and he starts to laugh, and it's infectious. Other people start to laugh too, not as loudly, but you can hear others joining in. Well, blessed are you who weep now, for you will laugh. This world is full of painful injustice. God's people, those who belong to Jesus, will be pressured and persecuted and even exiled, just like the Old Testament prophets. But here, Jesus wants people to hear and know, his disciples to know, that God welcomes you, that God accepts you, and he will reverse that weeping, because he's promised one day to reverse those injustices, to mend the brokenhearted, to release the captive, to free the oppressed. Jesus has promised to do that, and one day he'll deliver, and those who weep will be overcome with laughter and joy at the sheer wonder that God has turned this world upside down. Finally, Jesus says, blessed are you when people hate you, when they exclude you and insult you and reject your name as evil because of the Son of Man. Blessed, fortunate are you, says Jesus, when you are persecuted. Why? Well, we actually discover in the next verse, because great is your reward in heaven. See, what Jesus is doing is that there's two sets of values that you can live by. Jesus is saying this to his disciples, but it's just as true for us. There's the values of your culture, the values of your society, the values that you grow up with and are surrounded by, or there are the values of the kingdom of God. Now, sometimes they even overlap. But if you drill down, you'll discover that in many instances, they're actually very separate, very distinct. And we'll see that in a second when we look at the woes. And so Jesus is saying, actually, if you live according to the values of the kingdom, that means you're going to live outside of or in opposition to at times to the values of the world. And when that happens, you'll be persecuted. You'll be pressured. You'll come under fire. But you're blessed. Why? Because your reward is heaven. Actually, the values of the kingdom are upside down. They're in contrast to the values of the world, but the kingdom is eternal. Heaven is eternal. And so what might be painful and what might be difficult, what might be costly now, will pale in significance to the reward of heaven and being in God's presence and kingdom forever. In light of that, of course you're blessed, fortunate, content, because you have a greater perspective of reality, a greater perspective of what really matters. And Jesus finishes these blessings by explaining that to live like that is in fact to live like the Old Testament prophets of old. And if you looked at the lives of the Old Testament prophets, those who spoke the words of God, who were chosen by God to give God's message, to call people to himself, you would see that most of their lives were full of hardship and persecution and walking against and living in opposition to those around them. But just as they were faithful, and so their reward is great, so too will the faithfulness of God's people be rewarded. Well, Jesus then goes on to give 4 woes. I'm not going to ask Siri what a woe is, but when I typically think of a woe, I think of Crush from Finding Nemo, who's like, whoa, dude. But I don't think that's the kind of whoa that we have in mind here. It's more like it's not a whoa, it's a whoa, not looking good, uh-oh kind of woe. These are bad things. Again, there's 4 of them. I think Luke just wants to make sure it's nicely balanced. So what are those 4? Well, they're actually in contrast and opposite to the 4 blessings. Woe to you who are rich, for you have already received your comfort. What Jesus is saying is, in this up-down sense of the God's kingdom versus the world, when your life is full of good things, and look, I live in 21st century Australia, my life is full of good things, there's a constant temptation for the rich to believe and hold on to the fact that this is what really matters, that this is the key to satisfaction in life. That these are the things worth holding on to, but Jesus is saying, actually, woe to you, you've already received your comfort, and one day you're going to find that you're actually holding an empty bag. That what you thought really mattered no longer matters. That what you thought would provide you security and comfort and satisfaction may have done so temporarily, but has actually found to have rotted away, to have had no eternal or lasting value. Jesus goes on, woe to you who are well fed, as opposed to blessed who are hungry. Well, woe to you who are well fed, for you will go hungry. Woe to you who are full, who are satisfied, who have no sense of lack. Why? Because one day it will be revealed to have been empty all along. It will lead to a dissatisfaction. What you've filled your lives in to satisfy you will, like the first woe, you will discover ultimately is empty. And when you have that sense of lack, it will be too late. Woe to you who laugh now, for you will mourn and weep. Now, Jesus isn't literally saying, you're in trouble if you laugh. I think Jesus, probably enjoyed quite a good laugh. What he's talking about is this sense of shallow fullness. Our bags are full. As people who are rich, we have no sense of lack. And so we eat, drink, and be merry. Life's terrific, as if this is all there is. But it's a shallow fullness. As we seek to insulate ourselves from pain and discomfort. But again, one day this will be revealed to be empty in light of eternity. The things that we have put so much stock in to satisfy ourselves will be unable to do so. Finally, woe to you when everyone speaks well of you. For that is how the ancestors treated the false prophets. Woe to you who are popular. Now we want to be popular, don't we? We want to be liked. Who wants to be liked? I want to be liked. I'd much rather you like me than you didn't like me. I'm a people pleaser. That's one of my struggles. I want to be liked by everyone. But the danger behind that, says Jesus, if you live a life seeking to please people and seeking to be liked by everyone, you'll discover it's very hard to hold on to integrity. It's very hard to be true in terms of good character. You'll be constantly tempted and to compromise your values and what you stand for. As someone once said, if you stand for everything, you end up discovering that you stand for nothing. Well, what Jesus is saying here ultimately is there's one you should really seek to please. That is God. Seek to please Him. And Jesus references again the Old Testament prophets, this time the false prophets. Why? Because they said the things that everyone wanted to hear. They were liked. And what it didn't matter if what they said wasn't true to them or wasn't from God. They wanted to be in the good graces of others. And so truth, they could toss it aside. What God wanted and the warnings that God gave and how God wanted people to live was inconsequential because it was better to be liked. And Jesus says, woe to people like that. Actually know who you are, know who God is, resolve in yourself to please Him. Ultimately, this passage is about the world's values and God's values and the fact that they're very, very different. And it's worth, as we bring our episode to a close, and I know this has been a little longer today, I want us to think, whether you're a God follower or not, look at God's values, look at the values of your society and culture in which you live, and go, ultimately, if I'm being really honest, what is going to bring a greater sense of fulfillment? What is going to bring a greater sense of satisfaction? Truly, if I'm living in one of these particular ways, what is going to be the better life lived? Not necessarily the easier life lived or the most painless life lived, but the fullest and most satisfying life lived. And I'd want to suggest, I think Jesus is suggesting, that the most fullest and satisfying life lived is a life lived in light of the values of God's kingdom, a life lived like Jesus. If you're not persuaded yet, that's totally okay. Keep joining with me. And for those of you that are, do some diagnostic work. What are the ways I live that don't reflect the kingdom of God? What can I do about that? Maybe pick one thing and have a go. Next episode, it gets even more difficult. Jesus calls us to love our enemies. But that's enough for today. Thanks so much for joining me. Can't wait to see you next time. Bye.